Good evening. Welcome to the virtual London School of Economics for this event, which promises to be a really fascinating one. And what we're going to be talking about today is a book. Now, I'm an academic, so I'm very lucky that I get to read a lot of books. But traditionally, with all due respect to my colleagues, I tend not to remember them after 5 years, let alone after 25. And today's event, we're going to be talking about an exception. And this is a book, Will Hutton's The State We're In. Now, this is a really interesting and important work of the time. This copy actually is my original copy, and it was brought to me by my grandmother, Pat, who brought it me, and she's left a little note in there to tell me it's to help out with my economics A-level. And I got an A, so thanks, Will. But it's a vivid, engaging polemic, which is really a sort of diagnosis of the problems of the UK of the time and a sort of suggestion for some solutions. And I think it's a really interesting piece of work, partly because of the problems it names about high inequality, an economy dominated by London and finance, a government, a fourth-term Conservative government, which is dogged by sleaze allegations, some issues around the royal family and some sort of problems with some of the princes. And so it's a really interesting book, I think, to discuss now. But you'll have guessed from my introduction that we're not just going to be talking about the state we were in, if I can say it like that, but also about the state we're in now. It's not just about the book, it's about the current situation of progressive politics in today's UK. So I'm delighted to welcome three really fantastic speakers today. So first of all, we have Will Hutton. So Will is, as you will probably know, a very, very well-known British journalist, used to be the editor of The Observer, still writes a column. He's also been principal of Hertford College, Oxford. He's been the director of the Work Foundation, where we work together. He's an affiliate of the LSE's Centre for Economic Performance, and he's chair of the Academy of Social Sciences, one of our august bodies. Now, Will's going to be kicking off today with about a sort of 30-minute discussion of the book and what it means now. I should say that having worked with Will, one of his former colleagues sent me a message before today saying to make sure that he sticks to time. Sometimes he can run on a little bit, so I'm going to be I'm going to be quite strict there. Now, after Will's spoken, we're going to be joined by Alison Mcgovern Mp, who is part of one of the most intelligent and dynamic of the sort of new wave of progressive politicians. She's been MP for Wirral South since 2010, Shadow Minister for Media, Culture and Sport. Just a fantastic CV. She's been also from my perspective, it's wonderful that she's agreed to join us today because I remember discussing these issues with her when we were at university together 20 odd years ago at UCL. And our final speaker also has a sort of pretty very impressive CV. So Morgan Cbe. Now, Jeff is Professor of Collective Intelligence, Public Policy and Social Innovation at UCL. But what's impressive about his career, one of the things which is, I think, very unusual, is the way that he has spanned academia and public policy over the years. So he was an advisor to Gordon Brown, worked in Prime Minister's Strategy Unit, Director of Policy in Number 10, as well as now having been director of the think tank Demos, which I think he helped found, director of Nesta, Young Foundation. I mean, he's really been a sort of titan of British public policy over the years, as well as being an academic fellow of I think he's visited the LSE, Melbourne, MIT, many of the sort of big institutions. So we have a wonderful panel tonight. Now, after they speak, so Jeff and Ali are going to talk for about sort of 10-15 minutes each. At the end, once everyone has spoken, there's going to be plenty of time for questions. And please, please, please put some questions in the comments box. And Emily Douglas, who's one of our brilliant staff here at the LSE, she's going to be sort of collating those questions, and we'll have a bit of a dialogue at the end of it. So, with no further ado, Will, Jeff, Ali, thank you so much for joining us. And I'll hand over to you, Will. Thank you.
Thank you, Neil. Thank you very much. Well, I'm going to, after that, I really am going to try and do it in 30 minutes. The state we're in, I mean, it defined my life, actually. I mean, it was a break point, inflection point. I was told some years back it was the second best-selling economics book of the 20th century after Keynes's Economic Consequences of the Peace. And it was, I mean, really an astonishing moment. I mean, the first print run was 3,000, and it sold over 300,000. It stayed number one on the non-fiction best-selling charts for 7 or 8 months, 25 years ago. Became a national talking point. And why? I mean, rereading it, and I thought I'd take the opportunity. I haven't actually, I've read parts of it, but never read the whole of it for 25 years. And what kind of strikes me, I mean, apart from the fact, the young Will Hutton was quite fired up, I have to say, or the middle-aged Will Hutton was very fired up, is what a completely damning critique of how British capitalism, turbocharged by the Thatcherite New Right reforms, had become dysfunctional, along with a dysfunctional market society that had spawned. And I think I'm perhaps the wrong person. I mean, we'll find out from Alison and Jeff what they think, but in your question and answer. But I mean, rereading it, what strikes me is how kind of anxious I was and still am to kind of understand Britain as an interconnected system. It all connected. That was the constitution, the financial system, the firm, the labor market, the market society, all of it connected. And you had to understand it as a system. And I think the other thing that was important about it was that it kind of met the spirit of the time, because it was crucially and emphatically, although a critique of British capitalism, it wasn't socialist. Its remedies are remedies to make a dysfunctional capitalism functional and give it a kind of moral foundation, and construct an inclusive high trust society. And its intellectual influences were Galbraith, were Keynes, were Polanyi, Durkheim, Weber. They certainly weren't Marx or the socialist tradition. Equally, it was absolutely a kind of non-Tory book. I mean, it was not Hayekian. And because I mean, the left and the right have, in their own ways, a systemic critique. I mean, Mrs. Thatcher had a systemic critique of Britain, that it was insufficiently capitalist, insufficiently market-based, and she too saw it as locking together as a system, and her reforms, privatization, deregulation, were kind of very much in that mindset. But by the time I published the book, it was all that had obviously run into the sand. And on the other hand, of course, the left has a systemic critique. I mean, British capitalism needed and needs, because there's still that kind of element around on the British left, to be socialized. And I took the view then, and I take the view now, and I think that's important in the discussion of progressive politics, that actually the kind of full-blooded socialism is I don't think the British kind of children of the Enlightenment and persuaded of fairness and the merits of kind of public and private, really they don't want to go for full socialization. And anyway, it had founded where it had been tried, and even the partial version launched by Attlee in the 45-51 government had not succeeded tremendously well economically, although less badly, I think, than some of the right-wing critics kind of insist, and certainly socially, I mean, the NHS. But I've always thought of the NHS as less of a socialist institution, but an institution in which we collectively insure ourselves against the brute bad luck of illness. I see it as a kind of very effective collective, centralized and kind of insurance scheme. And so there we were, two kind of systemic theories of why Britain was in trouble, left and right not working. And here was this alternative, non-socialist, fiercely liberal, social democratic kind of systemic critique of how to analyze, how to think about it. And I think that I was articulating what obviously millions felt, and Jeff was kind of close to both Tony and Gordon, so he'll be able to illuminate this more. But it was what New Labour seemed to be reaching for in the run-up to the '97 election, and actually did partially. So I mean, just a kind of 5 minutes on kind of how I saw it systemically in '96, and then kind of let's flip to now and see to what extent this framework works and remedies work and might illuminate progressive politics in 2021. So, I mean, for me, the heart of the dysfunctionality of British capitalism was the interaction between a financial system that had grown up in the Industrial Revolution, very disengaged from industry, and the way it interacted with the core capitalist construct, the firm, which was run solely around the idea of the sovereign shareholder and the sovereign kind of property owner, and not recognizing the claims, responsibilities, the legitimate claims and responsibilities of many other stakeholders, crucially kind of employees and customers, but also, the claims that their nature might have on the firm. And so that was the heart of it. I mean, if you minded, if you've got the time, the chapter to read, which sets that out, is Tomorrow's Money Today, chapter 6. And I remember when I finished it thinking, I remember running around the garden, kind of shouting, Eureka, I thought this was the best chapter that I'd read anywhere, trying to kind of nail the shortcomings of the British financial system. And actually, I pretty much stand by it 25 years on. I looked at the disengaged way that the Brits allowed BL to go to the wall compared with the very engaged way the Japanese had turned around a similar car company, Mazda, at the time. I looked at the way Hutton Trust had marched through British business, taking over company after company, with Gordon White, Lord Hanson's accomplice, proudly saying, as I say in the book, that he'd never ever entered the shop floor of any of the companies they'd taken over. It might distort his view of the need to do whatever he had to do, that the financial numbers dictated. And what characterized all of it was very short-term paybacks, 3 years, very high returns of 20% real, disengagement, anti-science, anti-innovation, and it led to, coupled with the macroeconomic policies of the Thatcherite years, the medium-term financial strategy, which led to a very overvalued exchange rate, deindustrialization. But you could only make the labor market work in such a world if it was much more flexible. Hence the succession of acts attacking the power of trade unions, and actually the creation of what I call the 30-30-40 society. 40% of the, only 40% of the adult working population having tenured, secure, pensionable employment, another 30% having insecure forms of work, temporary, part-time, what we now call gig, and 30% kind of either work poor or out of the labor market altogether, or formerly unemployed. And that captured Tony Blair's imagination. He said, he used it in a conference speech, the 30-30-40 society. It kind of captured the inequalities of British society, which weren't just inequalities of income, but they're kind of inequalities of life, chance, and kind of circumstance. And I went on, and how privatization was kind of, and the role of the market and individual self-interest and pursuit of individual was kind of everywhere. It was in shopping malls, it was in television, it was intruding into family life. It was kind of diminishing the British. And I thought, attacks on it were bounced off a whole kind of nexus of interests that benefited from it, notably, private schools, the landed, the city, obviously. And it was all, and he referred to that in introduction, Neil, it was all kind of sanctified by what I call the culture of gentlemanliness. And when I hear sometimes, Boris Johnson and with his mellifluous tones and the Tory cabinet, what they all have is the received pronunciation and that sense that this is the officer class, born to rule. If there's time, I'll read out a section on gentlemanliness, which I was proud of at the time. Actually, I'm going to read it out. I think it's important. Just gives a sense of what the book was like, and actually to what extent these issues still confront us as progressives. The gentlemanly ideal, I wrote, is difficult to define. That's part of its mystique, but there's no doubting its motivating power for generations of English men and women. A gentleman does not try too hard, is understated in his approach to life, celebrates sport, games, and pleasure. He's fair-minded, he has good manners, he's relaxed, in control of his time, has independent means, is steady under fire. A gentleman's word is his bond. He does not lie, takes pride in being practical, distrusts foreigners, is public-spirited, and above all, keeps his distance from those below him. The gentleman is a human island, simultaneously aware of the nuances of rank, will recognize the importance of integrity and reputation in his relationship with his peers. The civilization fostered by such values is extraordinarily favorable to finance, commerce, administration, but not to industry. And when I look at the recently the co-chairs of the Council of Science and Technology, Lord Brown and Sir Patrick Vallance, co-wrote a letter and a report to the Prime Minister and the Chancellor, insisting that British finance was just not savvy enough about knowledge, was too gentlemanly. And I quote Herbert Levenstein, who was running a dyes company just before the First World War, making exactly that point 115 years ago. So, you know, what's changed? Vallance and Brown, gentlemanliness, a financial system that is kind of utterly kind of averse to kind of science. It's not gentlemanly to be too interested in science. Maybe changing a bit, but fundamentally, look at the if you want to get an IPO off the ground and get a good valuation for it, you don't float it in London, you float it in New York. And of course, all of the conservative hegemony was very dominant. You mentioned that in your intro, you know, and it is, you know, it's the English summer from Wimbledon through badminton and Ascot. It's the Lord Lieutenants of all our counties, and the sense that to be conservative is not being political. You're political if you're on the left, but if you're conservative, you're not political. What made me at the time so kind of coldly angry was that there was needless economic dysfunction. The personal costs of living in a market society were high, and actually, you mentioned it, the abuse of the Constitution. I mean, cash for questions, and the Henry VIII powers, Tory MPs feathering their nest. I mean, it was all there in the 1990s, and in its way, shocking, as shocking as what we're living through at the moment. And I also felt strongly that Labour had been complicit in this. Labour was too it deferred too much to the Constitution. It wanted to win a majority in the first past the post system and socialize the country, and believed there was a huge appetite for that. And I just felt it gave, in a way, I'm writing in 96, I thought that how the left had given the Tories a free pass from 1979 onward. And I would say the same now, actually. And I think that Len McCluskey's recent biography is an extraordinary tribute to that way of thinking. You know, one last push and we would have won in 2017 under Jeremy Corbyn and socialized Britain. That would be massively popular. I disagreed with that in 1996. I disagreed with that in 2021. And my answer was citizenship, economic, political, and social citizenship. Let's have stakeholder capitalism. Let's have stronger intermediate institutions. Let's reassert the social contract, and let's try and get our constitution right to confer that citizenship across the board. Well, where are we today? Well, I mean, I have to say, we've made some progress. I mean, we do have an independent central bank, and on its court. I mean, in 1994. Norman Lamont's Chancellor and the nice John Major refused to allow a trade unionist to sit on the court of the Bank of England, and it's worth noticing that Francis O'Grady now sits on it. You know, it has changed, and the Tory, the Bank of England has used its independence to some substantive reform, actually, of the way the financial system operates and the way monetary policy operates. So, you know, under Mark Carney, we do the banks. It's not only interest rates which moderate banks' behaviour. It's also going to be the Bank of England will discount loans that the banks have made to commerce, industry, business, and discount them for cash. until 2016, we were the only central bank in the world that didn't do that. And one of the reasons why the banking system was so biased against business. And the Vickers reforms have separated commercial banking from investment banking. There's a statutory regulator, Section 172 that Labour passed in the Companies Act in 2006, which Jeff had a hand in, which requires companies to take notice of other stakeholders apart from shareholders, has now been hardened by the Corporate Governance Code, so that every company that's quoted and every private company has to declare its purpose over and above being a profit maximizer and looking after shareholders. There's an investment community which take investing on environment and societal and governance grounds much more seriously. It's not the same story that I was inveighing against 25 years ago. Incomes inequality has stopped widening, even though inequality of wealth has got more monumental. And some of the terrible things that happened in the 1990s, like massive repossessions, have been kind of stemmed by having fixed rate mortgages and building societies and banks, as they did during the COVID crisis, being much more benevolent than they were in the 1990s. I ran Hertford College, Oxford. Thank you for mentioning that. 82% of our intake when I left came from state schools, and Oxford's intake from state schools is now 2/3 when it was under a half and at the state we're in. That's an improvement. Trade union membership has stopped falling. You've got the Prime Minister talking about levelling up. And actually, you can't talk about levelling up without talking about how the system should respond. So, I wouldn't want to argue that actually, nothing has changed. There has been some movement, but here's my big point. I think that any party, any progressive party, any party to the left has to have a critique of capitalism. And you may not want to go for full Marxist socialization, the means of production, but if you're going to be a party of the left, you've got to be reformist, and you've got to get a line and get your critique of the current capitalism, right. And I think that we have a very kind of interesting development in British capitalism. You've got what I've called the privatization of the private. Publicly quoted companies, there were 3,000 of them when I wrote The State We're In. There's only 1,000 today. Of that 1,000 that are quoted, a growing number do take the stakeholder approach that I advocated back in the day much more seriously. They really take the delivery of, they declare their purpose. They have to under the Corporate Governance Code. They're held to account for it by their shareholders increasingly. Many of them are taking a commitment to net zero seriously. I mean, this is not the world of Lord Hanson 25 years ago. This is where I think things start to get interesting. If you look at the London stock market is the worst performing since 2000 of any in the G7 and amongst the worst in the OECD. Why? Because we have very few innovative big companies coming through, and the kind of legacy kind of economic structures that are reason why the poor economic performance in the North and the Midlands is still there. And a lot of the business models kind of that are that you can buy and sell on the London stock market are essentially rentier. I mean, there's not much innovation. People have a commanding position, a monopoly or a near monopoly, and they exploit it. And that's what attracts private equity. And we've got this boom in private equity, which in many respects, is kind of a Lord Hanson on steroids. But private equity isn't all bad. I mean, some private equity takes purpose seriously, and other is just kind of extracting value. So you have two capitalisms sitting side by side with one another. Kind of one, a kind of stakeholder approach that aches and wants to be more innovative and is looking for support structures, and another capitalism side by side with that, which is very rentier oriented, very value extractive, and still throwing up the kind of dynastic fortunes that actually disfigure our society. Scale-ups are very disappointing, little presence in high tech, and actually post-Brexit, without any real industrial strategy, the growth rate in Britain, and I was despairing, writing in 1996 that the growth rate might be falling from 3.25%, it might fall to a little more than 2%, I wrote. We've got to do something. Here I am in 2021. The growth rate in 23, 24, 25, according to the Office of Budget Responsibility, is going to be 1.2, 1.3%. and that's sitting side by side with, all the inequalities. The tenured, the 40% have even more advantages now, I think, than they had back in the day. But that 30%, that bit in the middle, are they've grown. One of the things about the flexible labour market is we've got more people in employment than before, and that 30 is nearer 35, and the other 30 is nearer 25. But that 35 is extraordinarily insecure. That's the world of the gig economy, where an awful amount of risk has been displaced onto the shoulders of ordinary people. And this kind of inside or outside a labour market is really showing its face. And that's meant it harder to get a mortgage, so that home ownership is falling, especially for the under 40s. You've got 2,000 food banks, 2.5 million food parcels in 2021, it looks like. And dentistry, free dentistry for less than half the population. Anyone who's ever had a toothache will know how there's the circumstances in which a lot of people are living, especially around our coast and some of the kind of smaller towns on either side of the Pennines and around the deindustrialized Midlands. Just horrible. Families falling apart, and very poor health, life expectancy falling. And then some of the things that worried me about the market society ranking schools by league table and all the rest of it. My God, anyone who's a parent of a 11, 12, 13 or 14-year-old child, especially the girl, the girls take it much more seriously. How many likes you've got, on Instagram or on Twitter or on whatever you're following, being excluded from whatever WhatsApp group, seeing the party that you're in, that your friends are invited to, but you're not in real time. My God, the kind of managing the fallout of the way in which IT and information technology is compounding the kind of imperfections of a market society. Really tricky, I think. And actually, I read that piece about gentlemanly capitalism. The gents are still in charge. An Etonian Prime Minister, Cameron, is succeeded by an Etonian, Boris Johnson. And what I think increasingly is that within that 40% of privileged, there's a kind of half to 1% of the population where being upper middle class is hardening into a caste, where actually who you marry and how you educate your children, where they're educated, what university they go to, what profession they do once they've grown up, are handed on. And actually inheritance tax is not opening it up at all. The take from inheritance tax is derisory. And I'm concerned that Britain in 2021 is developing something that was observable in 96, but dynasties of upper middle class families occupying the favoured housing and the favoured jobs in an economy that's actually going nowhere. So, that's how I would see the state we're in 2021, and the constitutional settlement as more obviously fraying at the seams now than it was then. Scotland's independence question mark, what's going to happen in Northern Ireland? I think, frankly, if Northern Ireland stays in both the European single market and the UK single market, there will be an investment boom there. And I think that the case for reunification Ireland will become very hard to resist. And that'll be the beginning of the end of the United Kingdom. But Henry VIII powers on trade. I was inveighing against Henry VIII powers. I was inveighing against cash for questions. I was inveighing against the selling of lordships and peerages in the House of Lords 25 years ago. And now the going rate seems to be 3 million, if you believe the Sunday Times. So, I wear for progressive politics and all of this. And I think, we can't, I was very struck. The 80s began with the medium-term financial strategy, which was, the New Right program of constraining public expenditure, constraining borrowing, constraining the growth of money supply, constraining the state, open the door to privatization, necessarily leading to deregulation of the labour market. It was the medium-term financial strategy. And actually, it was coherent in its own way. It was intellectually underpinned by economics I disagreed with, but which I understood its intellectual roots. And I increasingly think that Brexit for the right plays the same kind of role as the MTFS did in 1980. It is, their project for the next decade. And that's certainly the Spartans and the right of the Tory party, I think, saw it in that way. It was going to open the door for, Singapore on Thames, deregulation, cutting free from the burdensome red tape of Europe, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But but there's no intellectual coherence to it at all. And that's becoming more obvious by the month. And what it's leading to is actually a kind of at least right-wing politics in the 1980s was a right-wing politics which was based upon Hayekian philosophy, Friedmanite economic theory. I mean, you could attack it philosophically and attack its intellectual foundations, as I did as a good Keynesian. In the 2020s, my fear is that Brexit is so kind of hopelessly got no sound intellectual roots that actually the fallback position is going to be for the right, a politics of identity and a politics of the flag and a politics of populist nationalism. And that is hard for progressives to take on. But just to round up into my last few minutes, the good news is for us is I think there's the best in British business and the best in the high-tech startup community recognize that capitalism does need a reset, and they recognize that that business has to be driven by purpose first and foremost, from which profits follow. And that is a profound statement, and that actually the stakeholder approach to thinking about capitalism is right. And I think that argument is being won, not completely won, but it's there to be driven home. Secondly, I think levelling up, and I'm glad the Prime Minister has put that on the political intellectual agenda. I think it opens the way for progressives to argue that the only way to successfully level up is actually to embrace a new capitalism, to leapfrog what currently exists, and to really kind of build kind of clusters of knowledge-based excellence and innovation clusters, as well as the everyday economy. And that requires a much more systemic approach to the way our financial system operates and the way our firms are governed than hitherto. It also means a root and branch overhaul of government. I mean, the Levelling Up Department is the smallest of the 9 departments that has to kind of coordinate their activities. And it's clear if you're going to successfully do this, and we can't raise the British growth rate from the abysmally low levels it is at, raise stagnant productivity from the abysmal levels it is at, without a successful levelling up program. And, to do that requires coordinated government and a constitution overhaul. And I do think that's got to be part of the progressive story. Another part of the progressive story has to be an understanding of actually what's happening in our families and what's happening and how kind of insecurity and risk and kind of lack of material well-being is actually tearing people apart. I mean, the social question, I think, is really got to be kind of absolutely put kind of more firmly on the map. I think big tech does need a reset. I'm sure Jeff will talk to that. The Constitution, leave aside the machinery of government, but if we're going to preserve these islands in some kind of amity, Scotland, Wales have got to be part of and actually our city regions in England have got to be part of a more federal constitution. That's clear, and I'm right with Gordon Brown on this. I think he's completely right. And actually, levelling up has exposed the imperial mindset of those at centre. I touched on this in the state we're in. There was a very, very fine book called The Rise of Gentlemanly Capitalism, a two-volume book on our history, and actually looking at the way the story of empire and the story of industrialization was shot through with this notion of gentlemanliness, that actually industry was happened by accident, and we didn't purposefully construct institutions to foster the industrial revolution back in the day. Hence, we don't have industrial banks like the Germans, and we don't have infrastructure banks Hence, we've never thought carefully about the constitution of our firms. We've never needed to. It's all been really essentially about, men mainly, kind of in tweeds and brogues, with a kind of gun kind of nestling under their arm, about to go shooting. And that we have to attack that culture. I mean, my last few sentences, and you're quite right to call me to account. I have been going for 30 minutes, and I have 31.
31.
And what I think binds all this together is actually thinking about trying to promote, and here is the fundamental point of any progressive position, a critique of capitalism, a critique of the societal conditions it throws up, and arguing for economic, social, and political citizenship informed by Enlightenment values as a solution, and building a movement around that. And I think that there's things to say about Keynesian economics and how to attack kind of the Benthamites.
And you can say them.
Dominates our economic thought, but that's for another day. I did that in the stateroom, and I won't do that tonight. That's enough from me. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thanks, Will. Thank you very much. And yeah, almost a time, but not bad by the standards of things. Look, we're going to move on to Ali now. So Will says, that any progressive party has to have a critique of capitalism. That's one of the things he just said just now. So do you agree with his critique of capitalism? What do you think of the book? And also, can I ask you, I'm worried that this is going to be too nice, and I think we should all disagree on stuff rather than just, we've seen a sort of...
Let's have a heated debate, come on.
Yeah, let's have a heated debate. So what did he get wrong? What's wrong with Will's approach on the world, and, what's missing from his work?
Well, I think that looking back on the book now and rereading the book now, I think that there are some parts of the British economy that have been very important that probably the book doesn't give a lot of importance to. There's a lot of focus on science and industry, which is right, but one of the great success stories of the British economy over the past 25 years has been the creative industries. But I'll come to that in a minute. I think that's a really important bit. And I suppose the other bit that really struck me as I was reading through is this point about the response to the culture war, that it's kind of one thing to say, the gentlemanly culture of the natural way in which the Tory party ought to be in power, according to some. And it's a whole other thing to see what too often the Conservative Party and those who are, I suppose, of a particularly socially conservative mindset fall into, which is these totemic issues of immigration, of racial and gender divides, the thing that we probably call the culture war now, and whether actually the progressive argument has to be much more about that, and whether that's should be at the forefront more. And I think that's definitely something that, looking back on, I wonder if there could have been more in that in the book. But anyway, Neil, I hope you'll permit me to be like a bit kind of odious and sucking up for a minute about the book, because as you rightly said earlier, we went to university in 1999 and had this book and its aftermath. And I think that I remember the very important cultural moment of the late 90s and feeling that sense of possibility. And we were at London University at UCL, and it felt like an incredibly positive time to be in a city. People forget actually how bad of a time London had had in the 1980s and early 90s. And it was just kind of waking up from that. And, we were heading to London-wide government once again, and there was so much hope. It's almost easy for me to be, as a person who doesn't believe in nostalgia, to be nostalgic about the late 1990s. But this book was important for, I suppose, what I think of as my generation of politicians, because I understood all too well what I had lived through politically as a child and growing up into my teenage years. I knew that Margaret Thatcher and the Tory party did not care about families like mine very much. That was evident. And particularly being from Merseyside, I knew that sort of broadly their ideas weren't our ideas. A large number of my friends at school had ended up either with a parent being made redundant, or in several cases having to move in with grandparents because they lost their house. So the kind of shadow of those years really stayed with me for a very long time. But Will's book taught me not just what I'd lived through politically, which I knew only too well, but what I'd lived through economically. And I learned, ironically, more respect for Margaret Thatcher's position as an ideologue. I thought she was just a politician, but I learned that she was a proper ideologue, somebody who had brought this, who'd brought real force to these new ideas, to this philosophy about the way that markets ought to work, and that markets could tell you everything about the value of a firm or a thing, and that it was as simple as that. But it also opened up a whole new world for me of an economic alternative. And I remember reading the book for the first time, and I'd never heard the name Galbraith before I read this book, and I'd certainly never heard of the likes of Blanchflower, Hills, Stiglitz, and many others who became very familiar to me soon after. But it opened up a whole new world of a different way of thinking that had been only too absent, as you might imagine, in the somewhat, how can I put this, black and white kind of political environment of Merseyside in the 1980s and the 1990s. The idea that there might be a third alternative had not occurred to me. So it's very, very important. I think that, just some of the commentary about the state of politics then is quite painful to read through now. It feels as though we left the stable door open, quite honestly. Yeah. But I also think that it's not one of the things that the book doesn't get it wrong, but and Jeff will know even more about this than I do. But if the theory of the book is that where power lies is hugely influential on how the economy functions, and that you need to get your institutions in the right shape for economic policy making, then we had a broken system of governance for the UK. It got better. The Scottish and Welsh devolution made it hugely better, and London devolution, and what happened in Northern Ireland. But English regional institutions needed to be more solid and more powerful than they are now, much less than they became soon after Labour took power. And I think that progress in England, particularly in the redistribution of power, really stalled. And then, of course, we come to Brexit, which has just been an unmitigated disaster for the redistribution of power, given that so much of the kind of regional approach of the European Union has been taken back to Westminster. One final thing before I conclude on the kind of where I think the balance of getting it right and the things that happened in the 25 years since that perhaps weren't foreseen. The book is huge on the role of finance and how capital flows and how they affect almost everything. I mean, I think, in fact, if I may quote from the book and from the end of Tomorrow's Money Today, I reread this sentence and I think it is everything. The disintegration of family life and the decline in the public realm that disfigure contemporary Britain may seem far removed from London's financial markets, but they are as linked to them as remote shocks are to the epicenter of an earthquake. Yes, sir. And, that sense that actually most people in Britain do not understand the capital markets, but they affect almost every aspect of their life. That is really a hugely important insight. And I think I would very much agree with Will's point, which is that, but now we're seeing that in digital and social media culture, and the way that these huge social media companies and digital companies, from their bases in the US, are having a massive influence on our economic and social lives in a way that we never really planned for. And in a way that, I think it's arguable that is kind of worse than Thatcherism, because Margaret Thatcher at least believed in competition.
Yeah.
She at least believed in kind of that, that the market should function. Whereas many of them, we're dealing with like monopolies and oligopolies, which is hugely problematic. And it's particularly problematic for people who would wish to be successful in our creative industries, because they simply cannot control the way that they access their market. And I could wax lyrical for hours on, Spotify and Netflix and, a number of others on that front. But I'll shut up in a second, but I would just sort of conclude by saying that it is such an important book because it was this incredibly thorough analysis. The state we're in, this is where we are. But crucially, it was also not a counsel of despair. It was a plan for a new Britain that basically had a theory of change at its heart, which is that if you saw that the way that power was distributed was driving the distribution of capital, which was driving the distribution of opportunity in British society, if you understood how that worked, you could also change it. And I think if you take that analysis now, it's still right. If we add to that the fact that Britain is a more multicultural society than it was 25 years ago, it's a society more interested in fairness and opportunity and diversity than it was 25 years ago, then I think there is an incredibly compelling case for a progressive government.
Thanks, Ali. That's like wonderful stuff. Bit too nice, but we'll let you off because I'm going to ask Jeff to be really.
Your Jeff's going to be unpleasant.
I'm going to ask him to be really horrible. Reflections on the book. I'm particularly interested, Jeff, in did it actually change anything? Because people write a lot of books and then they don't. Well, I have a lot of books and they don't seem to change very much. And then I would also quite like you to reflect on this tech point, right? Because it seems to me like tech is sort of, dominating the economy in a way which finance was in that period. So sort of any reflections on that would be great. So Jeff, thank you very much.
Yeah, well, I agree with almost every word both Will and Ali have said, but I will try and be argumentative. And I'm actually surprised how few books you have on your bookcase behind you, Neil. But I assume that's because you're probably not at home.
I'm at home. I had to move all the children's books.
Okay. So I'm just going to make 3 points. I mean, first, for those of you who weren't around in 1995, I think it's just worth saying 1 minute on that moment. That came after 20 years, not only of Thatcherite neoliberal political dominance, but also intellectual dominance. They had been making the running. The left had been left behind, it had divided, it was angry, it kept failing, it kept losing elections. There was such a sort of national depression by the early 90s that this book came along and offered a diagnosis, a prescription, it pulled all the themes together and written in the sort of inimitable, lively, energetic and positive style of Will, just filled such an extraordinary need people had for a sense-making narrative. And most of the arguments were not particularly novel ones, the idea of the dominance of finance over industry, of London over the regions, short-termism, lack of R&D investment, the networks into the public schools, elite power, the story of failed modernization of the constitution. These had been the standard tropes of the centre-left for several decades, but they were pulled together with great clarity and vim. And it is in a way extraordinary how many parallels there are today with the Onions. And the weird thing about Boris Johnson is he says, fuck business, but I love banks, which is almost, which we sometimes forget. He said that only several times in speeches. So 2 points perhaps of to open up argument. So one which hasn't been mentioned is the status of declinism. So I think it's easy to forget that by the 1980s, most of the British elite and the intellectuals assumed Britain was in long-term remorseless decline relative to France, Germany, Japan, and the United States. On the right, this was attributed to the welfare state, the trade unions, and to the gentlemanly values we'll describe. There was a whole slew of right-wing books making very similar arguments about the dominance of finance over industry and entrepreneurship. They were very influential. The left had its version, which again ascribed Britain's inevitable decline to the city, short-termism, monarchy, House of Lords, and so on. And this was the conventional wisdom. And actually, the statement we're in, reading it again, has a lot of that declinism in it. If you read it and really believed the diagnosis, you would expect Britain now to be a much poorer country than Germany, France, or the US. Now, since this is an LSE event, you can all go online and see the facts. The surprising facts are that actually since 1995 or since the 80s, the UK has grown slightly faster than the US, France, Germany, and so on. It still has huge problems of productivity and so on, but that declinist story on both left and right turned out to be fundamentally wrong, to everyone's surprise, in a way. And even in terms of equality, it was wrong. US median income went up, I think, 16% since the 70s. In the UK, it's 80%. We still have lots of inequality, but not quite as was expected. Now, I think the reasons, there's a lot of complicated reasons. Some of them are about the steps which were taken under Labour to fix the constitution, public services, to shift investment, blah, blah, blah. They were also to do with migration, the extraordinary pulling in of talent and energy into the big cities, particularly of the UK. And there was a big story about the knowledge, creative industries and so on, which Ali mentioned. But at the time of the state we're in, the one critique I wrote of it at the time said it was too focused on manufacturing and wasn't taking account of actually what the big new sources of growth would be, where Silicon Valley actually was a place to look, not so more than Japan and Germany. And I think that critique was basically right. And the UK economy turned out to be better suited to those kind of industries and growing firms in them than much of continental Europe, and has had a wall of a different kind, not private equity, but venture capital investment coming in as a result, which has, created lots of jobs and opportunities with all the imbalances we're very familiar with. So I think it's very important to at least ask the question, now, how wrong was declinism, which was absolutely conventional wisdom back then, and what lessons do we learn from it? And then the final point I want to make, which is maybe the big one, is, if you were doing the state we're in for 2022, let's say, what would be the same and what would be different? I had to do a much smaller exercise a few months ago for the Progressive Governance Summit, which is when the centre-left parties of the world come together. People like Olaf Scholz just become Chancellor, Justin Trudeau, Jacinda Ardern, the Scandinavians, to talk about what is a progressive political programme. And I wrote not nearly as long a piece and not nearly as well written, but tried to make sense of what is a progressive agenda right now. And it crystallized for me perhaps one issue with the state we're in. I think the book, very much mirroring what Margaret Thatcher would have thought, has law and money at its core. In some ways, these are thought of as the sort of hard underpinnings of political economy and the state. And you have to change both of those, capital markets on the one hand, constitutions on the other. And clearly these are hugely important still. But I think that this rather masculine view of how the world works is also deeply misleading and leaves out many of the things which are actually core to politics now. And Ali said a little bit about this. Many of them are about psychology and identity and culture and feelings and so on, not about hard money and hard law. And that's in fact where the right has often outplayed the left in the last 10 years. Many of them are about ecology and climate change. And it's good to see the German Greens now with a foreign minister. That was largely invisible in that kind of classic political economy. It had very little really to say about ecological issues, which are now so central. Obviously digital, third, that most of the top 10 companies in the world are based on data and knowledge and platforms. There's all the issues around that, how you grow them, regulate them, etc., are now core to modern progressive politics, how you protect kids from being ruined by Instagram. And then I'd also say how the state works. If you're going to take 20, 30, 40% of GDP for the state, its operations are as important as the operation of of the private sector. And the left often has rather lacked any very good ideas about how to modernize, reform, transform the state using the tools available to us. This is much of what I spend my life working on nowadays with government, so I'm a bit obsessed with it. But it's so often been a sort of blind side of the centre left that it thought the state was almost a black box machinery you could just put money through and expect results to come. So these are, I think, some of the issues. And weirdly, of course, Boris Johnson has, in his programme, with levelling up, but also net zero and playing culture wars, sort of grasps that this is the political territory of the 2020s, means you have to be playing in those spaces as well as the issues of capital law and constitution and so on. So, I mean, I'm not saying you should have necessarily got that in 1995, but I think in a way what it reinforced to me rereading the book is we do need, as it were, a new sort of synthetic account of both the diagnosis and prescription. There isn't an equivalent book out there now. I would love someone to write it, but I think it would have different chapter headings and a different, sort of focus in terms of what matters and how to achieve that sort of majority coalition for change than was appropriate in the post-Thatcherite years of the 90s. So maybe someone who is listening or watching today will be that author of the next state we are in.
Thank you. Will, do you want to respond to either Ali or Jeff at this point, or can I start getting nasty with my questions?
Well, why don't you get nasty in your questions? I'm very interested by what both said, actually. I concede, and I'm struck. One of the weaknesses I think in the book is that I'm very manufacturing the trade deficit ever getting bigger. I mean, actually, the manufacturing trade deficit is astonishingly high in the UK. Actually, and so is our current account deficit. I mean, they are, but it's been going for 25 years, and I thought that was unsustainable, and it's plainly sustainable. That said, here there's a line somewhere where I worry that the trend of conservative thinking might lead us to leave Europe. I think no, obviously impossible. And another line, there's another throwaway line where I worry that actually this mountain of debt might lead to a financial crisis. I don't build on it. They just kind of, when I was writing, I obviously thought this thought crossed my mind. So I do think that while I got stuff wrong, there was other stuff I got right. But I do think your twin points, both of you, one about the creative industries, completely. Two, declinism, and three, your point at the end there, Jeff, which I'm not sure. I'm not sure I completely get it. We must discuss it in greater depth. But you are right. As a state we're in this respect, if I understand you correctly, you're kind of trying to say that not law, not money. Think. I don't know. Think data. Think digital coalitions. Think new social movements. I wasn't quite sure what you were inviting me. You're right. I need to escape the kind of 20th century, kind of that 20th century framework a bit and get into a 21st century kind of frame. But I'm not quite sure. I'm still not quite certain how to pin that down. So that's my reflections on what you both said. But thank you, by the way, for what you both said.
So let me say a few things which I think, we're going to come to the questions in just a second. So it seems to me, so Jeff's got a really interesting point around sort of, you're too declinist, both Jeff and Ali talk about sort of changes. You ignored sort of changes in the economy, the way that was going to change. Jeff's point there, I think, was about sort of identity politics. So the thing which I found strange about the book, right, was that reading it, so there's a bit in the conclusion where you talk about the Conservative Party has become accustomed to power and has constructed an effectively hegemonic political position. And you wrote this in 1996. And I feel, so so I guess I'd sort of, be interested in your sort of response to that. And then just running through some of the questions. So Andrew Lone has asked, to what extent does our current Prime Minister, I guess our current politics still sort of, You know, how much of this gentlemanliness is that still sort of, you know, today? And then Max, who's one of our sort of people at the LSE, he's asked the question of, like, you know, does this charisma, this sort of like charisma type gentlemanly politics, is that why we're ending up with a sort of brand focused politics of sort of leveling up and rather than sort of actual sort of substance of policy change? And I'll go with Will first, but I'll ask Ali and Jeff for reflections on those as well, please.
Yeah, I mean, I do. I mean, I am struck how, you know, politics, how performative politics has become. I mean, you know, I mean, Andrew Marr's leaving the BBC. Is Andrew Neil going to come back? In a way, they're quasi-political figures as much as interviewers, and the way in which, you know, Nadine Dorris is culture secretary, I mean, put there because she's performative rather than because she knows anything, as she demonstrated this afternoon, not knowing that Channel 4 survives completely on private money and not public money. And, you know, politics and we're all kind of swimming in a kind of stream of data that comes at us. You can almost kind of, you can make the data almost fit any kind of thesis you may have. And there's a decline of, there's fewer and fewer kind of facts that you can kind of, these are public facts which are true. And everything is kind of quite partisan. Everything else becomes very partisan, and no one trusts the other. It's very, you know, and I don't know how to get hold of that. I don't know how, you know, Humpty has been shattered, and I'm not quite sure how to put him back together again, actually. And I wonder, you know, when I wrote The State Ran, I had a very clear sense of there being a liberal order that was restorable, you know, pluralist liberal order that was restorable. You know, now I'm not sure, you know, what is the order? You know, how would we, you know, what's the structures in which we would do pluralist politics? You know, how would we get to stakeholder capitalism? What would it look like? How, you know, what's a union movement look like that really grows vigorously? You know, what is it? How would you do employee voice in companies? I mean, I'm not saying, I mean, you know, I know these are the right questions to ask, but I'm uncertain about how to give you an effective answer. In the next 20 minutes, it would be great to get a few kind of a few pointers. So that's, it's not, as for gentlemanliness, I mean, I think Boris is a toff. His dad's a toff, and you know, when Caroline Wokes complained about, you know, him smacking her bottom, saying, you know, what a great seat she had, and he was that his kind of throwaway line, you know, to this appalling, you know, his throwaway line was, I don't recollect the moment, I don't recollect her. Hey ho, good day to you. I mean, it was. I'm throwing it off, and you know, Boris is the son of Stanley, and they're, you know, the family is this, you know, they're steeped in this culture. And actually, one of the difficulties for us on the progressive side of politics is that there is a kind of, you know, they're the officer class, you know, they went over the top in 1914, you know, they lost, those kinds of accents blew the whistle and men went over the top, and the first people to die were the whistleblowers themselves. They have a kind of legitimacy, curiously, in Britain. And the Tories themselves, and this is, I mean, to speak to the last bit of the book, Neil, that you picked up on. I mean, when David Cameron rang Lord Bruffin, former treasurer of the Tory party, now a Lord because he'd given 3 million to the party, at Lloyd's Bank, and asked him to lend to Greensill, you know, this front page story in the FT today. You know, what's going on in there, you know? And this is Tory to Tory, and they kind of think they are England, and that actually within the tribe anything goes because they're members of the same tribe. And it was the same feeling, I think, that why so many Tories went through the kind of yes votes to reform the Standards Commission, which they and defend Owen Paterson. He was a member of the tribe. You had to defend him, and you know, England is them. And kind of we connive in that on the progressive side of politics. And that's the hegemony that I was talking about in 95. Yes, we had, you know, 13 years of New Labour, but Jeff must speak. I mean, I never felt really, that New Labour felt it had it felt it had a temporary, it was temporarily occupying the government seats, the government benches. And actually, you know, the Telegraph and the Mail kind of still were framing the national conversation, even though there was a 200-seat majority. It never felt the inflection point it could and should have been. And now, you know, in 2021, 11 years into Toryism, and you know, you worry that we're going to lose the next election again. You know, I rest my case. I mean, and I think Johnson, you know, his tousled hair, you know, his Peppa Pig stuff in Tyneside at the CBI, and the way he comes back at the way he came back at Starmer in the House today. I disagree with that line of attack in that mellifluous received pronunciation. You know, we don't own the cultural signifiers of being the governors. I think it's really and it's disabling.
Great. Well, thank you. Ali, do you want to come in? So, I mean, two questions about sort of gentlemanly capitalism. Do we still have it?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting, this point, because I am in so many ways uniquely unqualified to participate in the gentlemanliness of capitalist British politics. And in Merseyside, I'm from the Wirral, right, which is the posh bit of Merseyside. And then I come to Westminster and I am like the bit of rough. It's like the most dramatic kind of dual life. But I think it's really interesting because whilst, yes, okay, the Labour government, maybe it never really felt like they owned the place. They bred a generation of people who decided that those people were not the boss of them. And that's not just, I think, those of us in politics. That is precisely the people who are kind of starting up their, you know, the kind of startup culture that we have in the UK, some of which is, you know, is problematic because actually we're offering people the prospect of starting and running their own business or being self-employed in a way that is never going to give them solidity of income. But that kind of sense of multiculturalism, you know, if you look at the data about some of the culture war attacks that the Tories have been trying to promulgate, they're not working. People don't, by and large, support their positions. And the idea that Boris Johnson is anything of a gentleman, when I think by any definition, you know, no gentleman would use the kind of language that I consider to be racist, not just verbally, but in print, you know, I think is not real. So I suppose I think I am more positive than you will, perhaps, that actually they haven't got quite the vice-like grip that perhaps some in the Telegraph think that they have. I mean, even in the Daily Telegraph, right, even has an incredible campaigning women's sports pages these days. So even they are trying to kind of buy into the shifting society. So I wonder if actually we're not in a better position than we might think. And there's certainly a generation of us in politics on the left that, are not owned by the attitude, you know, we're not cowed by it. Just look at Jess Phillips and Stella Creasy, for heaven's sake. They literally are just like smashing through conventions day by day. But the thing that I've really learned about being in politics for the past 11 years, sort of trying not to be cowed by the expectations of politics, I guess, is this thing about celebrity and, you know, whether actually in order to be in politics now, in order to be powerful, you have to have some kind of celebrity, because I think that's a really confused way of looking at where we are. I think, of course, you know, Nigel Farage never been elected to any British institution, member of the European Parliament, ironically, but never actually been elected to a British institution. But has had huge power because of celebrity, but equally so is Marcus Rashford, and he's a 24-year-old footballer. So like that's a thing that you can do. But in politics, real power is about the institutions you build. You have a short time in politics necessarily, but making the Bank of England independent has had a profound effect on our country. If we are able to craft regional and sub-regional institutions in England that are able to make economic policy, that will have a profound effect on our country. I learned through the Brexit wars of 2016 to 2019 that I wouldn't necessarily get what I wanted, but I could try and make the institution function, make the House of Commons function to represent the divide that was in the country and to try and craft a way forward. And arguably we failed because not because we weren't able to do that, but because in the end the incentives lined up for too many people to have a general election. But making the institutions work and function is where, in my opinion, real power is. And that's the way that you really get to redistribute and you really get to change the country. And all of the kind of noise is important, but not necessarily in the long term.
Okay. Thanks, Ali. Jeff?
Yeah, I'm probably like Ali. I'm actually a bit skeptical of this sort of exaggeration of Tory natural hegemony. It's true, as a party, it's been brilliant at reinventing itself and getting power and keeping power, but it makes mistakes. By the early 2000s, New Labour seemed very hegemonic. The Tories didn't know what to do. They couldn't capture, public opinion. The media was against them. Even their allies. And I think, in retrospect, what happened was a failure to embed that position from the left to build the right institutions. This was a constant argument I had with Mr. Blair inside government, institution building as a key, in a sense, hegemonic project. There wasn't the building of a party. It was all done very much from the top down, a sort of advertising model of how political parties should be run. And then a whole series of political mistakes were made in the following 10 years, which allowed the Conservatives to thrive. But I could easily see that turning around in a very short space of time. I think we greatly exaggerate in some ways the structural forces over the contingent tactical factors which shape elections. And the fact that Scholz is Chancellor in Germany barely a year after the SPD looked dead, is yet another proof of that. They happen all the time in modern politics. And there are two other reasons for thinking that. One is, and they're both sort of negatives in a way, we've sort of touched on 2007-8, but when capitalism literally almost collapsed and was bailed out by governments, ever since then, it's been very hard to be a pure capitalist believer anywhere in the world. That sort of almost intellectual and political ground disappeared. And you had to be about reforming capitalism or changing it or adjusting it. And of course, that was reinforced by COVID and the massive sort of state bailouts in the last 18 months. It's also reinforced by this social media issue, that just as TV transformed politics, obviously the age of Instagram and so on changes it too. And it is a politics which is much more performative in a way, much more perhaps emotional in its tone than would have been the case for the gentleman of 30, 40 years ago. But again, that makes it more open as well. You can combat in that space and win ground. I'm just disappointed. I don't think Labour is doing very well in that respect at all at the moment. But at least that's a new space. And then finally, the point I was trying to make, Will, about law and finance, was I don't anymore see them as the kind of the fundamental underpinnings off which everything is based. I think actually the key underpinnings for us now are the systems our lives depend on, the systems of energy, the systems of communication, the systems of food. And those are the place where politics has to have an account of how it's going to orient them to the public interest. And finance is part of that story, but it's nothing like as dominant a part of the story as it would have been a generation or two ago. And here I think we need new ways of thinking as well as new ways of acting. But that's a sort of 30-second summary of a much longer point.
Yeah. Interesting.
Will, do you want to come back on that?
No, I think that's really. I'm intrigued. I think that's. I think. Yeah. I'm trying to think whether I agree with that point. It's a clever point about systems. systems of finance, systems of energy, and I'm trying to marry it with your earlier point about the belief in institutions. One of the problems of New Labour is it didn't leave. It hardly left an institutional trace. Compared with the Attlee government, which left, the NHS. And I suspect the NHS is going to come totemic, not British, but internationally, actually, given the success with the boosters. And everyone's going to say we want, a centralised system like that. What did New Labour leave behind? Sure Start was great, but it wasn't embedded, and devolution to a degree. But I'm not quite sure how that marries with your point about systems. When you're saying an energy system, that's going to be, there's going to be kind of institutions in it, isn't there? It's not just going to be a stream of data or a myriad of producers and a myriad of consumers in a kind of stream. There are going to be energy companies, and there's going to be energy consumers, and energy regulators, aren't there? I'm not quite sure where that takes us, Jeff. What I do think, I strongly agree with you, is that please don't hear me, and those of you who remain on the call, for being too pessimist. I do think your point about, the SPD looked dead 12 months ago, now he's Chancellor, and Joe Biden looked out for the count, and now he's President. Contemporary politics can flip on a sixpence, it's so difficult to disentangle kind of I know Blenheim Park quite well, and the shooting parties in Blenheim, are incredible. I met somebody who said they'd actually decided to left the Conservative Party and became a Lib Dem because they weren't prepared to be part of the slaughter of animals in the park of Blenheim, in Blenheim Palace Park. The world of, the world the rich inhabit, the landed estates, the things they do, the yachts they sail, and the private jets they live in, the privatized, sealed world they is, and actually gentlemanly values are kind of saturated. And that is there, and they give a lot of money to the Tory party and. But you're right. If you look at high-tech startups, and actually the boards of some of our better public companies, they're not in that place at all. They're in a completely different place. They're purpose-driven. They want to make the world better through the companies that they form, and they're part of fluid networks. And I guess actually, Jeff, you'd say they're part of systems. And actually, they're very progressive. They like this conversation. They embrace the new. They want to experiment with new ways of living, and they kind of mock that other world. And that's part of this kind of trying to disentangle, which is the most vigorous part of the two capitalisms which confront us. This privatization of the private part with this kind of dynastic wealth which I described, and its links to Toryism, or a kind of quite an enlightened capitalism, which are very sympathetic to the kind of things we're saying, and very sympathetic, I must say, actually, Alison, to the Labour Party. I'm very struck by some of the reactions to Keir Starmer's speech, privately and publicly, in the wake of the CBI conference this week. So,
Will, I want to.
So yeah. I don't want to end by being pessimistic.
No.
I just throw one?
Yeah, go for it.
So I actually wrote a piece earlier this year on how narrow, as it were, the socioeconomic base of the current Johnsonite leadership is in historic terms. It has a base in a handful of newspapers, a handful of donors, and that's essentially it. It doesn't have a base in business, in science, in academia, in civil society, almost anywhere else. And it's quite unusual in historical terms to have a leadership with such a thin base. And that's actually also why he personally is pretty vulnerable to being booted out of his job in the not too distant.
That's a very good. I agree with that.
And Will, we've got 10 minutes left, so I want to finish off on policy, if that's okay, if that's not too. This is like working with you all over again. So, I mean, first of all, I want to talk about policy. So, some people have suggested that. Well, there's a great question, which is community wealth building, foundational economy, and the everyday economy natural successors at the stakeholder economy? So, I'll push that to sort of, Will. I guess, Jeff, Ali, Mark Frensham has a great point here about, Will made this point that the left are giving conservatives a free pass like they did in the 1980s. So he wants to know, how can a new progressive agenda be framed in a way that sort of unites the left? I think he's sort of interested. I'd be particularly interested in the views of Jeff and Ali on that.
Yes.
So Will, if we actually start off with a relatively quick answer on this point around community wealth building, is that a successor to stakeholder capitalism?
It's part of it. I mean, I think it's part of it. It's a decentralized local form of stakeholderdom, and I'm strongly in favor of it. I mean, but don't fetishize it too much. I mean, of course, I mean, and it can get very parochial very quickly. So there's downsides to it. But to the big question, it's part of a common. I mean, somewhere we have to have institutions of the common weal, it's very public ownership, stakeholder companies, this kind of common ownership at local level. Absolutely, it's all part of a family of institutions that would give the economy a very different motion and society a very different structure.
That was admirably concise, Will. Thank you very much. Ali, do you want to start off on this Mark's point around, how can you unite the left and sort of how can you frame a new progressive agenda?
Well, I have a very specific take on this, which is we need to win. The country can't afford any more Labour Party internal debates, navel gazing, or otherwise time wasting. And therefore, what we need, and I think what Keir's set out, and forgive me if I sound like a loyal frontbencher, but that's what I am. What we're setting out is a view about where the country should go in a way that we can build a broad coalition of voters so that we can win an election. So that means policies that affect huge amounts of people in their daily lives. And we've seen it over the past day or so with the social care announcement. We want to have wealth taxes to make sure that we are putting the burden on those with the broadest shoulders, and the Tories are doing the opposite. But there's a whole different set of areas. Education. I mean, giving kids proper opportunities to have a broad curriculum where they actually get an opportunity to learn about creative subjects, which have been totally stripped from the curriculum. Those kinds of things where parents right across the country and from all different backgrounds care about those things, and it gives us half a chance of building a big coalition of voters that will elect a Labour government. And so I'm not really sure exactly in what way the person asking the question thinks that we should unite the left, other than bringing together that coalition of voters so that we can win. Because the Labour Party really does let the country down when it spends far too much time pontificating on its own internal divides and not enough time winning elections and running the country. End of soapbox.
Thank you. Jeff.
Well, I mentioned the rather long thing I wrote for the Progressive Governance Summit for exactly this question. And one of its points was, don't just unite the left, you've got to reach quite a lot of people who probably don't think of themselves as the left. Talk to people not like you. I live in Luton rather than Blenheim Park, so I have a slightly different picture of the fellow citizens who need to be persuaded of an agenda. But the governments I work with, and I work with several which are coalitions of the centre-left, like in Finland, basically their programs have quite a simple structure. Well-being is at the core, and I still feel that is kind of obvious, but a very profound shift of thinking about policy and politics if you really take that seriously, and mental health and anxiety and all those other things. Secondly, net zero, obviously, a clear pathway for the next 10 or 20 years, but one which gives new opportunities in terms of jobs and skills and so on. It isn't just a burden and sacrifice. A transformed welfare state, which addresses issues like care, precariousness, and so on. And then fourth, the transformation of the state. So you are actually using a truly 21st century vehicle to achieve these things. Now, there's lots else, but those are not bad starting points, not just for uniting the centre left, but actually for appealing to a lot of people who might very easily vote Conservative if you're not offering that positive alternative for the future.
Thank you. That's great. Moving beyond Blenheim feels important, I guess. So I'm just going to finish up. We've got time for one very quick answer from you all, which is Ben Reed's got a really nice question, which is, what books or ideas are we going to be discussing in 25 years' time? And I'm going to exclude Jeff from mentioning any of his own books, although, because I've read them, they're excellent. And that's what I would say, but it's the question's going to Will first.
It gives me an opportunity to say something which I think is important. And you're thinking about this lecture. I was aware when I wrote The State We're In, and I think all of you made this point, and I was synthesizing so much that was around. I mean, there was, so much around. I mean, there was some great economics. There was the CBI were coming up with critiques of the financial system. So was the Bank of England. I mean, it was, the air was alive, and actually, I'm beginning to think that might be happening again. I'm beginning to think it might be happening again. I mean, I'm struck by what the Centre for Economic Performance is doing with the Resolution Foundation on the this critical decade. I'm struck by some of the books that are coming out. I mean, I'm halfway through Diane Cole's book, The Cog and the Monster. I think that some of the books we'll be talking about in 25 years' time will be some of the books that are thinking really hard about digital capitalism and the surveillance culture that goes with it. The powers of economic and social control that's going with digitalization has got enormous, and all the data, enormous power for good in all of that, but also it's quite menacing. I'm thinking of the kind of credit scoring system they have in China and how it can be adapted in European and American countries and the United States. So, I want to be optimistic at the end of this. I do think things can turn very quickly. I think there's lots of really good work going on that, a 40-something kind of Will Hutton or comparator could synthesize into something like that we're in. So I want to be upbeat. I think we can turn this around. That's
good. That's a great ending. Ali, quick comments. And then Jeff.
Well, I think probably the book I'm going to be reading in 25 years' time is a review of Jurgen Klopp's time managing Liverpool, but because nostalgia will have really set in. But actually, I think that Jeff was right. I think that public well-being is a very important kind of new front. And I've thought a lot about what we mean by well-being, because there's so much kind of Instagram, celebrity-driven kind of self-care sort of guff around that. I think from a point of view of public policy, we need to be really clear about the life that we think people should be able to expect. And I think that means success on your own terms. And so I think there's a lot to fill out in terms of public service reform about how we help people to understand their own well-being and what they want to achieve for themselves.
That's great.
Alongside kind of some of the competition issues where I think we actually need to rethink competition in the light of all of the digital stuff, but well-being.
Well-being, wonderful, thank you. And Jeff, to finish us off, thank you.
20 seconds. So I think there's a wonderful intellectual ferment going on in various domains I'm interested in, from psychology, computer science, systems complexity. I don't think that's yet reflected in the political economy. I can't think of a book equivalent to the state we're in now. And it's impossible to write, in part because in most of the fields I work on, the practice is quite a way ahead of the theory. And it's quite hard for the writers really to keep up with the frontiers of social innovation or digital innovation or and so on. And there may be almost be in a structural period, perhaps a book can't have the same impact Will had 25 years ago.
Wonderful. Thank you. As a theorist, I feel hurt, but that seems fair. Wonderful. Look, thank you so much, all three of you. It's been an extremely fascinating event. We have hired a brilliant undergraduate to do a review of the book, which should be out in a couple of weeks. So it's going to be really interesting to see what she makes of it, as someone who's in her sort of early 20s. So Rania Ramley, one of our brilliant undergraduates, is going to be producing that. This will be, of course, a podcast on the LSE website. I'm sorry if we didn't get to answer everyone's questions. And thank you so much once again. It's a real shame we can't do a round of applause. Thank you.